welcome. So a few reminders, if you've never been here before, there is a trash can over here on this side and one in the back of the room if you need to throw away your trash after you're done with your lunch. The restrooms are straight back through the door in the hallway if you need to go to the bathroom. I will ask that if you will take out your cell phones and go ahead and put them on silent. If you need to take a phone call, you can go outside, we'll let you back in. All right, so today, or this weekend, we also have an event going on, the Living History Military Time at the Revolutionary War Visitor Center here at 9:30 till 4, taking you through the war times. There is a flyer over at the door if you didn't grab one. And then the next Lunch and Learn is going to be about the Battle of Sullivan's Island on June 9th at 12 o'clock. Today, the program is sponsored by the South Carolina Humanities, a nonprofit organization inspiring, engaging, and enriching South Carolinian with programs on literature, history, culture, and heritage. Mr. Damon Fordham is a native from South Carolina. He received his master's degree in history from the College of Charleston and the Citadel. He has an undergraduate degree at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. Mr. Fordham is currently an adjacent professor at the Charleston Southern University and the Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, and has taught U.S. history and African American studies at the College of Charleston. So if you will please give a warm welcome to Mr. Fordham.
For those of you who don't know, the lyrics to that go, deep river, Lord, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I've got to cross over into Camp Brown. Now, during the days of slavery, slaves would sing that, and the slave master, who was not an insider to their culture, would listen to lyrics like that and say, oh, what a wonderful song about going down to the river and getting baptized. No. What that was actually about was getting off of that plantation. So, excuse me. What that was actually about, excuse me folks, I had some pork skins on the way here. Anyway, what that was about was sneaking off of that plantation so that they could leave and be free, but of course they couldn't sing it openly like that. So they had to be very clever and sing it in code in a way that people inside the culture would understand, but it would be a mystery to those outside the culture. And the point of that is that so often during this period, the African Americans are portrayed as being illiterate and ignorant and so forth during slavery, when in reality, they were forced to be illiterate and denied education. For as Frederick Douglass once correctly said, that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. And so thus, a lot of people had to develop a kind of folk knowledge and folk wisdom in order to get ahead and survive. And when education was available to them, a lot of them actually rose to the task, which is a story that is not widely known. And the story that I'm going to tell you today basically deals with a lesser-known aspect of that. It's about the 1895 segregation fight in South Carolina. It was a story that was buried for over 100 years. That when Benjamin Tillman, Pitchfork Ben, who was the senior senator of South Carolina from 1894 till 1918 when he died of a hemorrhage, Basically, he was the guy who was also the architect of the segregation laws of South Carolina. And at the time, it was a great news sensation around the world that 6 brave African-American leaders, Robert Smalls, the gentleman who was best known for sailing the ship the Planter out of Charleston Harbor and into freedom with his family out of slavery, William J. Whipper, a black lawyer from Beaufort and Charleston, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, South Carolina, Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown, and Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State University in Orangeburg. These men made a bold defense, an argument against segregation laws being passed in South Carolina. Now, wait a minute. If this story is not widely known, how did I know about this? Well, here's the story. You see, back around the 90s, I was reading a book called Lift Every Voice, which is a compilation of speeches of African Americans from the 1700s to 1901. And I came across one by Thomas Miller in which he was eloquently defending the right of African Americans to vote and not be segregated. So I read this speech and I thought, wow, this is inspiring. Let me look into this. So I went to the Caroliniana Library over in Columbia at USC, as well as the South Carolina Archives to dig up old newspaper stories from that era that covered this. And it turned out that their speeches and the whole convention about all this was very well covered by the Columbia State and the Charleston News and Courier newspapers. So I basically used that as well as surrounding journals from that time to document this story. And the messages of Robert Smalls were compiled by his daughter, and the ones of Thomas Miller were compiled by his wife, but nowhere existed a whole book that dealt on this subject until this, which is one of my proudest achievements. So, without further ado, here is what happened. I mentioned earlier that during slavery, the main thing was to, in order to keep this permanent class of cheap labor, which is there enslaved people, 2 things had to happen. Number 1, they had to be kept illiterate so that they would think that there was nothing more to their lives than drudgery and slavery. Because as Frederick Douglass understood, if you were illiterate, you would be exposed to other ideas than slavery and that sort of thing. And so they tried very hard to prevent that. Secondly, there was a deep fear in the South during this period that the poor whites, who were also maltreated and marginalized, would see how much in common they had with the African Americans and would come together to create a revolution that would overthrow the wealthy class of whites, which was the last thing that they wanted. As a matter of fact, Jefferson Davis, in a speech before Congress, 1859, said that one of the greater goods of slavery was that it kept white unity in the South. You didn't see strikes or the strife between the various white ethnics and so forth that you had in the North, because they had convinced the poor whites that if black people had equality with them, that the poor whites would be pushed to the bottom of society. Now, a man named James Henry Hamlin, senator from South Carolina, he wrote about this in a speech that he called the Mudsill Theory back in 1858 that gets into this. So it's important to understand that before we get into our story. So, after the fall of the Confederacy and the end of slavery, the federal government tried to reform the South by passing 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment of 1865 ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th Amendment in 1868 said all persons born here were citizens. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 said that all men born here had the right to vote. Women would get that in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So this led to the fact that African Americans throughout the South were voting and electing their own representatives. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 1872, they impeached a corrupt governor named Henry Warmoth for racketeering and embezzlement, and they replaced him with the first African-American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and he did such an excellent job as the interim governor that he decided to run for the United States Senate of Louisiana in 1873, which would have made him the second behind Hiram Revels of Mississippi in 1870. So he legitimately won the election, but the U.S. Senate refused to swear him in. Gee, I wonder why. Well, you know. So he appealed before the Democratic Party to no avail. And he appealed before the Republican Party to no avail. So according to the United States Congressional Record of June 8, 1874, page 432 to 433, Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback got up before the body of the United States House of Representatives and said, I am a man, and I am an American citizen, with all of the rights and the privileges that are due to an American citizen. But I say to you that from this day forward, I shall not follow the dictates of the Democratic Party. I shall not follow the dictates of the Republican Party. From this day forward, I shall only follow the dictates of my heart and of my conscience. And he still didn't get it. However, he became the founder of Southern University in Baton Rouge in 1880, which is one of the oldest and largest black colleges in the United States to this day. So as that was happening in Louisiana, here in South Carolina, from 1870 to 1877, there were two black lieutenant governors, Alonzo Jacob Ransier from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howard Blease from 1872 to 1877. Richard Howard Blease was lieutenant governor under Governor Franklin Jacob Moses. Note that name, Franklin Jacob Moses. First time in American history where the state was run by a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor. That would not happen again until New York in the early 2000s. So as all this was going on, here in South Carolina, some other really fascinating things were happening. At what is today known as the Julius Waties Waring Judicial Center on Broad and Meeting Streets in Charleston, where the federal courthouse is today, there once stood the Charleston Clubhouse that existed until the earthquake of 1886. And after the Civil War, with the damage done to the Capitol during Sherman and the Civil War and so forth, the state business was held there temporarily. But an amazing event happened there from January to April of 1868. 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered to rewrite the Constitution of South Carolina into the most progressive document in American history up to that time. And you can find it today at the State Archives as well as the Charleston County Library. This revolutionary document, called a Declaration of Rights, called for such things as all laws pertaining to racial discrimination be stricken from the books. Women would be allowed to divorce abusive husbands. There would be state hospitals and mental institutions. No one would go to jail for debt. And on January 23rd, 1868, the great Robert Smalls, who you see right over here, he got up and proposed the following. Resolved, all children in South Carolina between the ages of 7 and 14 must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of non-compliance. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first public school law ever passed this far south, below the Mason-Dixon line. Along with that, William J. Whipper, a black lawyer who practiced over on Broad Street, got up and tried to pass a law that said that the right to vote should not be limited on account of sex. He proposed 1 year before Wyoming made it legal for women to vote in South Carolina. But with all these other things that they passed during that session, That was considered way too radical, and they voted it down. Well, along with this, they determined that the Board of Trustees at the University of South Carolina be integrated. And in 1873, Henry Hayne from Marlborough County became the first African-American student ever to attend a school with whites in this part of the Deep South. And in the 1870s, you had a considerable number of black students at the University of South Carolina who were pictured on the bottom part of this cover here. And they even had an African-American professor named Professor Richard T. Green, who was over the library teaching metaphysics. Yeah, and that was the case from 1873 to 1877. University of South Carolina and Berea College in Kentucky were the only desegregated schools below the Mason-Dixon line. Now, when I bring up these things, people ask me two questions. Number one, why haven't I heard any of this before? And number two, well, what in the heck happened? I'll explain them both. Throughout the history of the Deep South, as I mentioned earlier, the wealthy class of whites' deepest fear was that the poor whites in their poverty and illiteracy and subjugation would find common cause with their black brethren and come together to create a revolution to overthrow the rule of the wealthy class of whites. So they indoctrinated the poor whites into the idea that if black people had equality with them, the poor whites would be pushed to the bottom of society. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. And that's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. So, on December 24th, 1865, at the courthouse in Pulaski, Tennessee, 6 Confederate veterans gathered to form the Resistance Army Against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. You see where that went? And so for the next 12 years, the Southland bathed in blood as blacks and whites battled out in the streets. Memphis Massacre 1866, New Orleans Massacre 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre 1873, Vicksburg, Mississippi Massacre 1874, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina Massacre 1876, Ellington, South Carolina Massacre 1876, and November the 8th, 1876, on Broad Street in downtown Charleston, blacks and whites battled it out in the middle of the street in gunfire, as well as Cane Hoy, South Carolina, in July that year. So, on February, therefore the federal government said, okay, this is too much. We can't handle this mess. We got to put a stop to this. So on February 26, 1877, they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise that ended Reconstruction. And one of the results of this was that Mildred Rutherford and her organization, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, went on a national crusade to censor things like what I just told you out of the history books used in classrooms and replace it with pro-Confederate narratives. Now, Mary Sims Oliphant's History of South Carolina that was used from 1917 up until 1984, the year after I graduated, said this about that 1868 convention that I told you about just now. More than half of the members of the legislature were Negroes, and most of them could neither read nor write. They nearly spent all their time in the legislature in stealing the money of the people. Thousands and thousands of dollars were taken by these black thieves. Neither the property or the lives of the white people were safe anywhere in the state. It must be realized that the state had a tremendous problem in the face of the sudden liberation of irresponsible, uneducated, unmoral, and brutish Africans. How nice. When I was in the 8th grade at Moultrie Middle School in Mount Pleasant in 1978, South Carolina, that same History of South Carolina, page 280, taught us that after the Civil War ended, the Negroes lost their heads, so the Ku Klux Klan was formed in Pulaski, Tennessee to bring order and stability back to the South. Well, fortunately for me, when I was a boy, I was a bookworm, I was a weirdo, I was bad at sports, I was awkward, so I read a lot. And among the things I read was Langston Hughes' Pictorial History of the Negro in America, and Eyewitness, the Negro in American History by William Loren Katz, who was a history teacher up in Brooklyn. And those books were my vaccination against what I was being taught in the classroom at that time. But the records of the 1868 Constitutional Convention basically, that was taken at the time, it was said, basically disproves all of what you just heard just now. Okay? Now, so after the fall of the Reconstruction era, now let me make something clear about the way. I am not getting up here and saying that everybody who was in the Reconstruction Congress was saintly or was above reproach and all of that. No, that's absolutism. Yes, there was some corruption going on during that time. But what often happens here is a kind of absolutism where they took the bad and left out the good, okay? To have something that's missing even in our own time when these things are discussed, which is balance. With me so far? All right, so here's the rest of the story. Now, after the fall of Reconstruction, it went on a downhill slide. So the 15th Amendment said that you cannot deny a person the right to vote because of their race, color, or natural origin, or previous condition of servitude, as long as they were born here or were naturalized citizens. So they got around things like that. They would deal with loopholes. For example, in November the 12th, 1879, a group of black men in Mount Pleasant were brought before the county courthouse on grounds of voting while illiterate. Well, it turned out some of the men were in fact illiterate. They thus interrogated, gave them on the stand about cross-examining on the Constitution and George Washington and Christopher Columbus to make them look ridiculous on the stand. But one of them was J.B. Maxwell, James Buchanan Maxwell, who was born in slavery in Flat Rock, North Carolina in 1856. And after the end of slavery, he somehow made his way to Boone Hall Plantation, Mount Pleasant, to where he was reunited with his parents. That's him up in the corner over here in this book. So when they brought him up there, they didn't know that he was a graduate of Charleston's Avery Institute, which is, what's that institute y'all had up here in Camden back in the day? It was a school for African Americans. It was
Mather.
Thank you, Mather. Very good. It was along the same lines as Mather. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. So when he got up on the stand and they tried to do shenanigans on him, he said repeatedly, "I can read, I can read, I can read," until the judge got flustered, banged the gavel, and dismissed him from the case. J.B. Maxwell was my great-grandfather. And when I was a boy, I thought that story was just a family wives' tale. But then in 2016, my cousin Cheryl Washington, who was a librarian in St. George, she found the trial transcript at the county library in Charleston, so it's in that book. Now, so since they couldn't come right out and say you can't vote if you were black, they tried stuff like this, which is in the August 29, 1892 edition of the Charleston News and Courier newspaper. A separate list of all Negro voters must be kept and returned with the poll list. Every Negro applying to vote must produce a written statement by 10 white men who shall swear that they know of their own knowledge that such voters voted for Governor Wade Hampton in 1876 and have voted the Democratic ticket continuously ever since. This statement must be placed in the ballot by the managers. Now, who could have passed something like that back then? Okay. So then they did what was called, and some of you may be familiar with this, the literacy test. You would go to the registrar and they would say, well, ask you, says, well, in order to vote, can you tell me how many bubbles are in a bar of soap? Or could you read this section of the Constitution and etc. Things like that. to deliver, because see, they gave the registrar power to determine who could or could not vote. Okay? They were slick about it. So, then in 1894, Benjamin Tillman won the Senate in South Carolina. Ben Tillman was born up in Trenton, South Carolina, over in Edgefield County. And they called him Pitchfork Ben because he threatened once to stab President Grover Cleveland with a pit in his fat ribs with a pitchfork. He was crude. His mouth was nasty. He was very profane and vulgar, given to fistfights on the Senate floor. And in the words of, and to paraphrase Forrest Gump, boy, did he love that N-word, and this and and that. And he made a following among the poor white farmers of South Carolina by threatening, by speaking against the aristocracy on one end and the blacks on the other, who he cultivated as the supposed enemy of the poor whites. And what particularly galled him was that the few black voters who were left in 1894 came very close to electing his opponent, a fellow by the name of Alexander Haskell. So he said he was going to finish that once and for all by unifying the white voters and effectively denying the votes, the right to vote of African Americans in South Carolina, making sure the schools and other things like that would be segregated from then onward. Okay? In other words, as I said before, divide and conquer. So that way he would have a permanent position among the poor whites of South Carolina, who were in the majority among the voters of that time. And oh, by the way, he also referred to the Citadel as the dude factory. He often spoke against higher education for the simple fact that most of his voters didn't have it. Okay? In other words, demagoguery. Now, so in 1895, he decided that he would throw out the Progressive Reconstruction Constitution and replace it with one calling for segregation. That was done in Mississippi in 1890, called the Mississippi Plan, all right, by Governor James K. Bartlett, the white chief of Mississippi, as he called himself. So Tillman seized upon this and decided to do the same thing in South Carolina. But black people demanded a seat at the table, and they decided to send 6 representatives to this convention that would be held from September 10th, 1895 to December 4th of that year. And these were, and I mentioned earlier, they were Robert Smalls of Beaufort, William J. Whipper of Charleston, Robert Anderson of Georgetown, James Wiggin-Isaiah Reed of Beaufort, and Thomas Miller, who would become the founding president of South Carolina State University. And on the stand at the State House, newspapers from around the world came to telegraph all of this to a worldwide audience. The chambers of the South Carolina State House were jam-packed night after night. And some of the speeches made were horrible. So much so that William J. Whipper got up and demanded that they stop using the N-word and other such profanities while making their speeches in regard to this bill. But then the African Americans who came there decided to basically give the speeches of their lives at this convention. Thomas Miller, the founding president of South Carolina State, had these words to say on the night of October the 25th, 1895 at the convention. Call us aliens, we aliens, the people who were the foundation of the American civilization. Aliens, a people who, by their sweat, assisted in clothing the barren rocks of the Northeast and Venture, who drained the swamps of the South, and who made them to mimic gold at harvest time, who, by their endurance, toil, and suffering, made it possible for our white neighbors to establish this government, the asylum of us all, who, by their toil, established the canal and railroad systems of this country. Call us aliens, then to whom can the term citizens be applied? Well, okay. And with this, of course, it was obviously jam-packed, and people around the world thrilled at reading these speeches. Okay? So, among others also was James Wade, okay, who was from Beaufort. He got up and said this, as far as that goes. This committee offers you white supremacy with white degradation. We offer you the supremacy of law, intelligence, and property. Who choose ye whom ye shall serve? Will you make justice, honor, law, fidelity, and the truth be the palladium of your liberties, or will you make injustice, perjury, and fraud the foundation of your policy? We have pled our cause. If you refuse to adjudicate our claims, and will yield to the inevitable, but we shall appeal from Philip drunk to Philip sober, we submit our case to the judgment of an enlightened public opinion and the advancement of a Christian civilization. Tell you, these guys are no joke. Now, you notice what I said earlier about how Mary Sims Oldman described these guys as ignorant, brutish, right? Well, the record shows from the actual reports that that was far from the case. Robert Smalls, on November 1st, 1895. My race has honored me with a seat on this floor, and I shall serve them to the best of my ability. My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life. I am proud of them, and they toward me, and I know that they are not ashamed of me, for they have at all times honored me with their votes. And he goes on to say that, but I stand here also as the equal of any man. Okay? William J. Whipper. This convention is about to make a grave mistake in giving the Negro latitude. The car of Negro progress is coming, and instead of allowing it to come on, you wish to stop it. You may as well just make up your minds that the Negro will rise. We will not be crushed. The Negro will rise sooner or later. Crush us as you may. The Negro, with our perseverance and our pluck, will and must come out. He cannot be kept down forever, for it is not the nature of human affairs. Woo! Been a while since we kind of heard that eloquence in public like that. Well, after all of this, William Henderson of Berkeley, one of the white representatives, got up and said these words. We don't propose to have any fair election. We will get left at that every time. Who will be the managers? Won't they be Democrats or Republicans? And don't you see it will be a bar to the Democrats? I tell you, gentlemen, if we have fair elections in Berkeley, we can't carry it. There's no use to talk about it. The black man is learning to read faster than the white man. And if he comes up and he can read, you have to let him vote. Now, you're going to throw it out? We are perfectly disgusted with hearing so much about fair elections. Talk all around, but if you make it fair, you will see what happened. The white delegates gave that a standing ovation. The Charleston News and Courier referred to Henderson as the Berkeley brave who made the star speech of the evening. Okay? And the Greenville Mountaineer said this: the white majority of the convention listened with unexampled patience to the speeches of these Negroes, and we have no criticism to make that's other than the fact that so much time was wasted. Such nice people. Well, as I mentioned, the whole world was reading this in the newspapers, and the telegraph lines were hot every night of stories of these great speeches that were made. So much so that the most famous black man in America decided to come and say what he had to say about that. I refer here to Professor Booker T. Washington, the principal of Tuskegee University now, the founder of Tuskegee down in Alabama. And this is when he decided that he would write an open letter to Benjamin Ryan Tillman, which says in part, Tuskegee, Alabama, November 4th, 1895. Dear sir, I am no politician. I never made a political speech and don't know as I will ever make one. So it is not a political subject that I address you. I was born a slave, you are freedmen. I am but one humble member of an unfortunate race. You a member of the great body, of the great intelligent Caucasian race. The difference between us is great, but yet I do believe that you will scorn the appeal I make to you, that you will not scorn the appeal I make to you on behalf of the 65,000 of my race in your state, who are today suppliants at your feet, whose destiny you hold in your hands. It has been said that the truest civilization of a race is the desire to assist the unfortunate. Judging by this standard, the southern states as a whole have reason to be concerned about what they have done to the Negro. I cannot believe that in the era of the eve of the 20th century, when there is so much enlightenment, generosity, and progress and self-sacrifice, that you would come across to make this thing to hinder the Negro in the midst of all the evidences of good feelings among our races. I cannot believe that you and your fellow members are engaged in constructing laws that will keep 65,000 of my weak, dependent, and unfortunate race in ignorance, poverty, and crime. And he went on to say that you, honored senator, are a student of history. Has there ever been a race that has been helped by ignorance? Has there ever been a race that was harmed by Christian intelligence? Will capital and immigration be attracted to a state in which 3 out of 5 are ignorant, where poverty and crime abound? And he said, honest sir, do not misunderstand me. I am not so selfish as to make this appeal to you in the interest of my race alone. For thank God, a white man is as dear to my heart as a black man. But I appeal to you in the interest of humanity. Whatever a man soweth, that he shall also reap. Woo! Booker T. Washington, in essence, predicted that if Tillman and these guys went ahead with those plans in basically keeping black people from voting and in separate but unequal education and so forth, that it would drag down the whole state. And he went on to say on another occasion that you cannot keep a man down in the ditch without getting dirty yourself. And the results of that showed in 1948, when 62% of the African American population was semi-literate and 18% of the white population was totally illiterate. So much so that during World War I, many even of the whites were disqualified from being drafted into World War II because of their illiteracy. And get this, the first IQ test that was given in 1917, the black soldiers from the North outscored the white soldiers from the South, particularly South Carolina, because of this sort of thing. So what Booker T. Washington was given to Benjamin Tillman was prophecy on that day. Incidentally, when Booker T. Washington would meet with Theodore Roosevelt and have dinner with him in 1901, Tillman, true to form, said that, quote, it would take us lynching 1,000 N-words to bring them back in their place after this. But ironically, Tillman and Booker did meet around 1909 when they both had some business involving the White House. And ironically, Tillman went away from Booker T. Washington saying that Booker T. Washington was an intelligent Negro who had a Jesuit face about him. Go figure. Well, anyway, so the convention was winding up during this time period. And so the vote came on December 4th, 1895. And the result went as follows. That it was the final vote of the convention was 116-7. The black delegates voted no, with Whipper and Miller abstaining. Robert Smalls joined the other black delegates in refusing to sign the complete Constitution and declared that he would rather walk home to Beaufort before signing such a document. T.E. Dudley, a white delegate from Marlborough County, was one of the 2 white delegates who refused to sign. He said that he voted no, that he felt it was unwise, and still held the opinion that it was basically a violation of the Constitution of the United States. John Halston Reed of Georgetown Another white delegate said, "My reason for voting no on the question of adopting the Constitution as a whole is that I have, from beginning to the end, opposed to the understanding clause of the Article of Suffrage. I believe it will upset if tested by the United States Supreme Court. It will open the door for fraud, and I think it is unnecessary." Okay? So, at the end of the convention, they banged the gavel. The black delegates left, and Tillman and his men got up and joined hands and sang, "God be with you until we meet again." And state after state in the South adapted segregation clauses down to Oklahoma was the last one in 1907. And Georgia was next to last in 1906. So, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court declared that segregation was legal. And Williams versus Mississippi in 1899 declared that constitutional conventions like what they had in South Carolina and Mississippi were legal, so that led to the downhill slide in all of this. But Sarah Smalls, the daughter of Robert Smalls, had this to say when she collected her father's speeches in a booklet, quote, "Indeed, it may have been an abject lesson planned by the all-wise God to teach the haughty, boastful sons of Carolina that they are Negroes, capable and amply qualified in every aspect to protect themselves whenever it becomes necessary to do so, that these few representatives of our race were but a very small part of the rising host that talent and education are bringing forward day after day in spite of lynching, caste prejudice, or any methods used against it." So the black community of Columbia had a celebration for these men at the Oddfellows Lodge Hall over on Gervais Street. And each of them spoke at that particular convention. And the story of these 6 men was largely forgotten in the history books. As a matter of fact, I was telling you earlier about Mary Sims Oldham. This is what she had to say in her textbooks about the Convention of 1895. Convention of 1895. The legislature in the session of 1894 called for an election of delegates to form a constitutional convention. The election was held, and they met in Columbia in September of 1895. They were reforms needed in many directions, but the first object of the convention was to redraft the election laws so as to give the white population protection against an overwhelming but illiterate Negro majority. The convention opened, committees were appointed, and the Constitution framed. The last Constitution of 1868 had been the work chiefly of aliens and Negroes without character. The Constitution framed in 1895 is the one that we have today. So it was with all this that I told you I was reading a book called Lift Every Voice that had that speech from Thomas Miller about call us aliens, right? So after this, I went to the State Archives in Columbia, the Carroll Indiana Library at the University of South Carolina, as well as the old microfilms of the Charleston News and Courier to piece together this story that had been buried for so many years. And because I thought it was pretty inspiring that in spite of their impending loss, these people really did inspire a lot of people. In fact, in 1945, down in Orangeburg, there was a collection of a book called Humorous Folk Tales of the South Carolina Negro. And they went around interviewing black people for their folk tales. A man named Murray Holiday told a folk tale about the black member of the Constitutional Convention that was debating Tillman. And when he got the better of Tillman, Tillman supposedly said, "You black rascal, I've got a mind to swallow you alive." And the black man replied, "If you do, you'll have more brains in your belly than you have in your head." So the story still lived on to some extent in the public memory through folklore. But one of the really interesting codas of this was that in 1901, the last of the black Reconstruction politicians was forced out of office in North Carolina. His name was George Henry White. And when Martin Luther King spoke in King Street in 1966, he quoted what I'm about to tell you. He spoke of how George Henry White, in his last speech before Congress, said the following, that this, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. But let me say, Phoenix like he will rise up someday and come again. These parting words are on behalf of an outraged, heartbroken, bruised, and bleeding, but God-fearing people, faithful, industrious, loyal people, rising people filled with potential force. Well, after he was out of Congress, the Congress became all white until 1928, when, due to the migration of black people from Mississippi to Chicago, they had a considerable voting bloc, and they elected Oscar de Priest to Congress in 1928, okay, making him the first African American to serve in Congress since Reconstruction. So, in February 10th, 1930, while Oscar de Priest was in Congress, he got up and said these words, "Mr. Speaker and members of the House, I wish to call to your attention to the fact that we have two ex-members of this body present today, and I wish to present them to you. One is ex-Congressman John Lynch of Mississippi, and the other is Thomas Miller of South Carolina, two of the black Reconstruction congressmen." They entered the chamber to applause. And Priest concluded, "I am glad to have the privilege of presenting these gentlemen to you. They happen to be of the race or group which I am identified, so I am not the only one left." 17 years later, July 12, 1947, Judge Julius Waties Waring, for whom the federal courthouse is named in Charleston again today, ruled in a case called Elmore versus Rice, that those laws passed with that Constitution that disfranchised black voters after Reconstruction violated the Constitution of the United States and the 15th Amendment. And he said as follows, "It is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union. It is time for South Carolina to fall in line with the other states and adopt the American way of conducting elections." Thank you. Now that I told you all that, do you have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Why do you think the two African American legislators abstained instead of voting against?
Well, they kind of saw where this was going. And they figured we did our part. They knew that the majority of the body, where they were going with that, so they just said, all right, we did what we had to do. No use in, just no use of that part. So they decided to abstain, and plus, none of them signed the actual Constitution once it was brought out. And in fact, Robert Small said that he would rather walk home from Beaufort before signing a rag like that. But, in fact, one of the others threatened to withhold his pay if he didn't sign the Constitution, but Ben Tillman was all proud, and Trump said, nah, give him his pay. Yeah. And incidentally, I should add this. One of the, as a sort of consolation prize to black South Carolinians, Tillman okayed the request to form South Carolina State University. And that was brought up by Robert Anderson of Georgetown to have such a university. And Thomas Miller, since he was being forced out of office anyway, was given the consolation prize of being the founding president. And that's why Miller Hall is in South Carolina State today. Yes, ma'am.
I was interested in just what she said about why didn't they vote? Why did they just decide not to vote?
Right.
And the explanation you gave was really good, a great explanation. So I think Booker Washington in our community seems as if a lot of us kind of see him as an appeaser. What he said to Tillman was powerful.
Yes.
And I'm like, was that done so that he could be kind of moderating the heat in the room collectively for us? and get more with, you explain.
I'd be more than happy to. You see, one of the unfortunate things about we American people, or maybe it's part of the, okay, you getting all this? Good. One of the things that's so unfortunate about history and current events is that people have a tendency of thinking in absolutes, okay? That these are the good guys, these were the bad people, okay? Now, in some cases, in the cases of Adolf Hitler or somebody like that, that's pretty accurate. But you gotta remember that human beings are complex. And there's a big difference between narrative and fact. Narratives are simple. Facts are complicated. Booker T. Washington, I've studied both him and Du Bois. In fact, when I was in Ghana at the place where he died when he was in exile in 1963. And I admire the good of both men, you see. I don't see it as one was good and one was evil. Both were sincere men who were trying to do something constructive to their people. Booker T, the thing about the difference was, Booker T and W.E.B. didn't get along very well. And so W.E.B. Du Bois was more of a man who taught at the higher level of colleges, so that narrative is what passed down over the years. Whereas the people who admired Booker T. Washington were the ones who spoke more word of mouth. And so therefore the people who followed Du Bois more or less took control of that narrative. And so the truth of the matter is that it was sort of like the whole idea between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Both were good, both men were about going the same place, but just taking different directions.
That's a good explanation.
Thank you.
But now I'm going to ask you about the Clarence Thomas situation.
What about
a Black Panther.
Yeah.
To now being on the
Heart of the conservative side.
exactly. Is that well? It's been detrimental for us as people. But again, explain that.
Okay, here's the story. Clarence Thomas was born poor in Pinpoint, Georgia, right outside Savannah. He was, his father left early, his mother couldn't take care of him. And by the way, before I go further in this, I'll explain that what I'm about to tell you is from his own autobiography, My Grandfather's Son, which I have. So anyway, Clarence was raised by his grandfather in Savannah. And the grandfather horsewhipped him like a mule to punish him, okay? But he sent Clarence to this middle-class Catholic black school in Savannah, all right? So here's Clarence, dirt poor, dark skinned, speaking Gullah, in this middle-class school. The kids there called him ABC, America's Blackest Child, all right? So he's dealing with that, and his grandfather is whipping him like a mule and forcing him to work at 4 in the morning, but still providing for his education, okay? In other words, he made Joe Jackson look like Mr. Rogers. So he deals with that, and then in 1968, the grandfather takes him out of the black Catholic school, sends him to the newly desegregated Catholic school in Savannah, right? Martin Luther King gets killed. Clarence is sad, and he goes to school. The white teachers are indifferent, and this one white kid who he thinks is his friend writes in a note in class, says, Clarence opens the note, "I like Martin Luther King." And then he flipped it over and the note said, "Good and dead." So with this, he somehow managed to go to first Holy Cross, then to Yale, right? So he's filled with all this rage and bitterness, and he gets caught up in the Black Panther movement. And when Bobby Seale of the Black Panther movement gets jailed for allegedly torturing and killing an informant named Alex Ratley, his crew goes out and riots in the streets, and while he's drunk, and then he looks at all this and he's like, what have I done and what have I become? And he realized that he'd gone far from what the grandfather tried to teach him. So this led to a ultra-conservative senator, I think his name was Dartmouth, Danforth, something like that, kind of took Clarence under his wing after that and gave him the mentoring that and the sympathetic ear he had been looking for all along. And it kind of went from there. So there's your answer.